So, as we are officially in March, we know for many of you out there, you kind of want a refresher. You need a refresher of the certain things that the NCAA Selection Committee does and does not look at when putting teams into the NCAA tournament and seeding them. So we bring in the expert on it. He is Greg Shaheen, former NCAA tournament executive, current advisor to the gods. He joins us on the phone. Greg, let's start with some of the misconceptions that we go through every year. But as a refresher, let me start with this one. 20 wins does not get you in the tournament automatically, correct?
Well, that is correct, sir. Well, that was a long-time watermark that people used as a rule of thumb. The reality is teams are playing more now, and so you'll have teams that will be playing as many as 40 games potentially, or even more, as the structure works now. So 20 games is going to do nothing to get you in the tournament. You got to win games, but 20 is not a watermark that counts.
It used to be important that your last 10 or your last 12 games matter, but they got rid of that a few years ago as well, correct?
As a specific criteria, yes, but it's important to understand why they got rid of it as a criteria, and that's because the data that the committee has available to it is sequential. So they're able to look at the entire season. So in truth, you're looking at the last 10, the last 12, the last 15 games as you look at that schedule. And so the concern was if you emphasize just the last 10 or the last 12, you're really disregarding either the non-conference or some portion of the season arbitrarily, and there's no reason to do that. So since the technology allows the committee to get so much more information, organize it in different ways, the notion of separating that out was something that they wanted to take care of. With that in mind, certainly the committee wants to see teams finishing strong as the year comes to a close.
All right, clear up conference affiliation. Do they care what conference you're in or how good your league is?
Well, anymore, it's also hard for people to even know what conference some teams are in, and that's important to keep in mind. And that's all the more reason that the committee doesn't look at things by a conference. Dave Gavitt, who founded the Big East Conference, used to say that you have your automatic qualifiers, and then the balance of the Division I membership are all in the pool for an at-large bid. So you have the automatic qualifiers for 32 conferences, and then you have 36 at-larges. It does not matter what conference they come from. There's no minimum. There's no maximum from where those teams should come. They just need to be the best ones in the committee's judgment.
So do they even look at what your conference record specifically is?
They won't as a breakout, but they'll know if you were the conference champion. And you have to logically understand that they're looking again at that full schedule. So you're going to see the conference play within there, and obviously those in the room know what conference they're affiliated with. With that said, I can guarantee you that at the conclusion of the selection process, if we were to ask around the room to the committee members, I would tell you that not one of them would accurately be able to tell you how many teams are in the field from any particular conference, and in some cases they'd be off by several because they're discussing so many teams throughout that 5-day period that knowing conference counts and using that as a criteria is just not something that can happen.
How does the committee handle injuries? For example, Wisconsin, in competition for a potential 1 seed, has a bad loss against a Rutgers team, but they didn't have their best player, Frank Kaminsky, in that game.
The committee will know that by a couple of different ways. The committee has 2 committee members that are dedicated to monitoring, for example, in the example you gave, the Big Ten Conference, there's a primary and secondary. Meanwhile, the rest of the committee, the other 8 members, are also expected to track on how the conference is doing. So those 2 committee members will definitely make sure that that enters into the discussion. Likewise, each of the conferences have access to a dedicated private system that goes directly to the committee where the best arguments for a team and pertinent information related to a team's record can be put into the system and made available to the committee. So that's where injuries or eligibility issues or flight problems that made a team get in at 6 o'clock in the morning on the day of a game or whatever can be entered. And then the committee has to decide how important that is. In the case of Frank Kaminsky missing during a Wisconsin game, that's going to be a huge factor as they would analyze that loss.
There's talk that Wisconsin could be perhaps the highest 2 seed, and yet because of geography, they might be put in the bracket with the highest 1 seed, Kentucky. Explain how the committee places a team in terms of true seeding versus geography.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that's why there are games still to be played. I would say any speculation on it is premature and has to be qualified that way, that there's so much that can happen between now and then. I would say one of my bigger questions is why would Wisconsin not necessarily be considered for the 1 line right now, including for losses like you just described, for that to be considered in their total body of work. There are certainly arguments for Wisconsin to be on the top line. But for the sake of discussion, the way in which the bracket comes together is that you first assign the regions. And so as you have the regions this year across the country, the committee will go in that true seed list that we were just talking about. They'll go in order. So Kentucky, if in this scenario is the overall number 1, they would go to the regional site that's closest to them. So in such a scenario, that I believe would be Cleveland. Then it would go down the pecking order, and wherever Wisconsin was, based on the closest region to it, assuming that it's the top Big Ten team, it would be assigned there, provided it was available.
And on Selection Sunday, before the brackets are announced, the Big Ten has its Big Ten Tournament Championship game. How does the committee handle 2 participants in that game from the Big Ten that could be moving depending on winning or losing that game?
Well, as you get down to that final few days, the committee will track who's still in the tournaments. And with the Big Ten being the final of the conference championships to be played on that Sunday just before selections are announced, the committee will have work to do depending on who's in that game and where the committee views the overall field. So let's say, for example, in a championship game, you would have a Wisconsin and Rutgers, just for the sake of looking at it. The committee has to contemplate what would happen, not if Wisconsin gets in, but if Rutgers gets in. So they would have to build a contingency bracket that contemplates Rutgers getting in as the automatic qualifier, and then Wisconsin going in as an at-large. So that does a couple of different things. It adds Rutgers to the field, and it knocks somebody out at the back end of the at-large field. And so the committee has to prepare for that. With the technology now and the way in which we've learned a lot more about how the selection process works over the last few years, they're able to anticipate that and build scenarios. When the SEC had a tornado go through downtown Atlanta a few years ago, the committee was essentially able to build 6 contingency brackets, I believe, on the final day to prepare for any of the eventualities that may come from play that day. And this will be no different this year. The committee will be prepared regardless of what the outcome is of the Big Ten game.
Greg, you've been involved in this for so long. If you could change one thing about the selection process, what would it be?
Well, I think the Big Ten actually is going to experience this when it goes to Madison Square Garden. I think the more that the Sunday games could be cleared out for the selection process, the better. I think it's hard for the committee to work the schedule en masse that weekend while games are going on. So many games are going on and so much uncertainty prevails. I think if we want the most accurate and complete take with everybody getting a fair shot, the committee being able to work all day on Sunday without championship games would be ideal. Now, there are many factors, as you know, that go into that likely make such a scenario impractical in that regard. But it is one of the things that, going forward, has to be contemplated. It's a lot of work that weekend, and those committee members have spent all year tracking on these things, and they do great work. But if we really wanted them to have the opportunity to bang it around with the full results known, play being done on Saturday night would be a fantastic thing for the fate of the bracket. Again, that's not a criticism of what they do now, just one of the things that would make it potentially even more sound reasoning as it goes into the bracket.
He's the best at making a complicated process sound simple. Greg Shaheen, thank you, sir, as always.
You got it. Take care.